Have you ever wondered what led to the most devastating conflict in human history, the Second World War? Let's rewind to the end of the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, was intended to establish peace and stability. However, it was seen as a harsh punishment by Germany, who was forced to accept full responsibility for the war, lose territory, and pay massive reparations. This left the country in a state of political and economic instability, setting the stage for the rise of extremism. Moving into the 1930s, we see the world gripped by an economic crisis. The Great Depression, as it was called, was a time of enormous hardship. Millions were unemployed and struggling to survive. It was in these desperate times that totalitarian regimes began to rise. In Germany, the Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, capitalized on the economic hardship and national resentment. Hitler promised to restore Germany's national pride and economic strength, and the people, desperate for change, rallied behind him. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini and his fascist party rose to power, promising to rebuild Italy into a great empire. And across the seas, in Japan, the military took control of the government, with visions of establishing a vast empire across Asia. These regimes, fueled by nationalism and a desire for expansion, began to aggressively pursue their goals. Germany defied the terms of the Treaty of Versailles by rearming and remilitarizing the Rhineland. Italy invaded Ethiopia, and Japan seized Manchuria. The world watched, but did little to stop these blatant acts of aggression. Despite the League of Nations and various diplomatic efforts, the world was unable to prevent the march towards war. The aggressive expansionist policies of Germany, Italy, and Japan were met with appeasement, rather than resistance. And so, the stage was set for a conflict of unprecedented scale. The world watched in shock as Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939. This was the spark that ignited the deadliest conflict in human history, the Second World War. Germany, under the rule of Adolf Hitler, sought to establish a new world order, dominated by the Aryan race. Poland, with its strategic location and rich resources, was the first target. Germany's Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, strategy caught Poland off guard. The speed and might of the German forces were unprecedented, leaving the Polish army overwhelmed and defeated in a matter of weeks. This was a new kind of warfare, defined by rapid, concentrated attacks intended to create disarray among the enemy's ranks. But the invasion of Poland was not just a military maneuver, it was a blatant violation of international law, an act of aggression that could not go unanswered. On September 3, just 2 days after the invasion began, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Allied powers, as they would come to be known, were drawn into the conflict, marking the beginning of a global war. In the early years of the war, the Axis powers, primarily Germany, Italy, and Japan, achieved a series of stunning victories. They expanded rapidly, occupying vast territories across Europe, Asia, and Africa. The Axis powers seemed unstoppable, their march of conquest fueled by a toxic mix of nationalism, militarism, and racial superiority. Yet, even as the Axis powers celebrated their early successes, the seeds of opposition were being sown. The Allied powers, though initially caught off guard, were beginning to mobilize. They were bolstered by a shared commitment to uphold international law, protect sovereign nations, and resist the spread of fascist ideologies. The world was now fully engulfed in war, with little hope of a swift resolution. The stage was set for years of brutal conflict, the reverberations of which would be felt for generations to come. The beginning of the Second World War marked a dark chapter in human history, a time of unprecedented violence and upheaval that would forever change the course of the world. The tide of the war began to shift in favor of the Allies. A statement that rings true as we delve into the turning points of the Second World War. In the icy realms of the Soviet Union, the Battle of Stalingrad unfolded. This was a grueling 5-month-long standoff between the Axis and Soviet forces. The brutality of the winter weather was matched only by the relentless fighting. The city of Stalingrad was reduced to rubble, but the Soviets held their ground. The Axis forces, underestimating the resolve of the Soviets in the merciless Russian winter, found themselves encircled and ultimately defeated. This marked the first major defeat of Hitler's armies and a significant shift in momentum. As we cross the globe towards the Pacific, we encounter the Battle of Midway. This pivotal naval battle was a decisive victory for the United States against the Japanese Empire. The US Navy, thanks to their code breakers, were able to anticipate and counter the Japanese attack. In a span of just a few days, the Japanese lost 4 of their fleet carriers, a blow from which they never fully recovered. This victory marked a turning point in the Pacific War, as the balance of power tilted towards the United States. Shifting our focus back to Europe, we find the Allied invasion of Italy. This was the first assault on the so-called Fortress Europe by the Allies. Despite fierce resistance, the Allies succeeded in toppling Mussolini's regime and opening a new front against Nazi Germany. This invasion not only diverted German resources but also served as a testing ground for the eventual Normandy invasion. Each of these battles, in their own unique way, changed the course of the war. They marked the transition from defense to offense for the Allies, and the beginning of the end for the Axis powers. Despite the heavy losses, the Allies had turned the tide and were now on the offensive. The end of the Second World War was as dramatic as its beginning. The wheels of change began to turn in earnest on June 6, 1944, a day that would forever be etched in history as D-Day. This marked the commencement of a massive Allied invasion on the beaches of Normandy, a strategic move aimed at liberating Western Europe from the clutches of Nazi Germany. The invasion was a colossal endeavor that involved over 150,000 troops crossing the English Channel, marking it as the largest amphibious assault in history. The battle was fierce, the stakes were high, and the cost was dear. But the Allies were relentless, and they succeeded in establishing a foothold in Europe. This pivotal moment sparked a chain of events that led to a steady push towards Berlin. The Allied forces, now bolstered and emboldened, began to reclaim territories that had been seized by the Axis powers. Inch by inch they advanced, liberating cities, freeing people, toppling the dominoes of the Nazi regime. But while the war was drawing to a close in Europe, the Pacific theater was still ablaze. The United States, in a bid to hasten the end of the war and prevent further loss of lives, made a decision that would forever change the course of history. In August 1945, they dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation was immediate and immense. The bombings claimed the lives of over 200,000 people, most of them civilians. The impact was not just physical but psychological. Japan, faced with such overwhelming devastation, made the decision to surrender. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, they signed the official instrument of surrender. This marked the end of the Second World War, a conflict that had lasted 6 long and grueling years. The world sighed in relief, but it was a sigh tinged with sorrow, for the cost of peace had been high. On September 2, 1945, the Second World War officially came to an end. The Second World War left a lasting impact on the world. It was not just a brutal conflict that claimed millions of lives, it was a turning point in human history that reshaped the global landscape. In the aftermath of the war, the world saw the emergence of the United Nations, an intergovernmental organization built on the ashes of the League of Nations. The United Nations was designed to promote peace, foster international cooperation, and prevent future conflicts. It was a beacon of hope in a world ravaged by war. But even as the world sought to prevent future conflicts, the seeds of a new conflict were being sown. The war had created 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. These 2 nations had been allies during the war, but in its aftermath their ideological differences became impossible to ignore. Thus began the Cold War, a period of political and military tension that lasted for almost half a century. The aftermath of the war also saw the beginning of decolonization. European powers, weakened by the war, could no longer hold on to their colonies. Countries in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East began to gain independence, changing the political map of the world. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's superpowers. Their ideological conflict defined the second half of the 20th century. It was a time of tension and fear, but also a time of unprecedented technological and scientific progress. In many ways, the world we live in today is shaped by the aftermath of the Second World War. The war led to significant changes in political, economic, and social structures. It changed the way nations interact with each other, and it changed the way we think about war and peace. The Second World War changed the world in ways that continue to be felt to this day. It was a conflict that defined a generation, and its impact is still seen in the world around us. It was a war that changed everything.